Part 6. Fighting Back. What next? Congratulations! You now know far more about all aspects of face masks than any of the doctors, politicians, public health officials, or other authorities who pushed, prodded, cajoled, coerced, and finally forced them on you, your friends, and your loved ones. In the process of acquiring this knowledge, we have examined some of the deceptive games played using the science, how the so-called experts actually know nothing like the amount they purport to, and how their rulemaking is often based more on visceral guesswork and moral assumptions no better than those of anyone else, in fact typically worse. While it is impossible for one person to do this level of research on more than a few topics, having seen how manipulative tricks are deployed in one area will give you some cross-immunity when the same techniques are tried in other areas. You are now more readily able to discern and resist the telltale hallmarks of manipulation elsewhere. So what now? In this final chapter, I offer some closing thoughts and suggestions. Ultimately, though, what use you make of this knowledge is up to you. It will be different for every person. The most important battleground is your own mind. Simply having this knowledge is beneficial. You are now far more able to resist and contest compulsory masking at every level if and when it tries to make a comeback, not just at the scientific or policy level, but at the more fundamental levels of the psychology and philosophy involved. Having read this book, you are now more able to help free those still trapped by the fear and false beliefs that led to compulsory masking. Even more importantly, you are personally better able to withstand and effectively oppose the philosophy and mentality behind compulsory masking when it manifests in other domains. Compulsory masking is currently in retreat, but the mentality that led to the self-inflicted disaster that was the COVID crisis cannot be eliminated. It is like an endemic virus. The specific symptoms and manifestations vary over time, but it will never completely go away because the attitudes and beliefs that give rise to it are renewed in many people each generation. Moreover, the court penchant for mooting so many of the challenges to compulsory masking just as they were gaining momentum means that the issue is guaranteed to return in either our lifetimes or those of our children unless we take action now to put additional barriers in place. What I have been referring to as the masking mentality is simply another term for a tendency present to one extent or another in all humans, myself included. It has many other names. Masking was simply the way this mentality manifested during the COVID crisis. The core trait of the masking mentality is what German Lutheran pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer referred to as stupidity, or folly, depending on which English translation of Bonhoeffer's writings you read. Pastor Bonhoeffer is best known for his courageous opposition to the Third Reich, for which he suffered arrest and execution. What is popularly known as Bonhoeffer's theory of stupidity comes from a letter essay he wrote to friends and family in December 1942. After 10 years of living under the rule of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Pastor Bonhoeffer wrote, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. One may protest against evil. It can be exposed and, if need be, prevented by use of force. Against stupidity we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moment the stupid person even becomes critical, and when facts are irrefutable, they are just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self-satisfied, and, being easily irritated, becomes dangerous by going on the attack. For that reason, greater caution is called for when dealing with a stupid person than with a malicious one. Never again will we try to persuade the stupid person with reasons, for it is senseless and dangerous. To Bonhoeffer, stupidity is in essence not an intellectual defect but a human one. There are human beings who are of remarkably agile intellect yet stupid, and others who are intellectually quite dull yet anything but stupid. The impression one gains is not so much that stupidity is a congenital defect, but that, under certain circumstances, people are made stupid or that they allow this to happen to them. It would seem that stupidity is perhaps less a psychological than a sociological problem. The process at work here is not that particular human capacities, for instance the intellect, suddenly atrophy or fail. Instead, it seems that under the overwhelming impact of rising power, humans are deprived of their inner independence and, more or less consciously, give up establishing an autonomous position toward the emerging circumstances. The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He is under a spell, blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person will also be capable of any evil, and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. As Bonhoeffer observed, this stupidity can arise from virtuous traits and good pro-social motives. Who can deny that in obedience, duty, and calling we Germans have again and again excelled in bravery and self-sacrifice? But the German has preserved his freedom by seeking deliverance from his own will through service to the community. The trouble was, he did not understand his world. He forgot that submissiveness and self-sacrifice could be exploited for evil ends. But Bonhoeffer also found a grain of consolation in these reflections on human folly. There is no reason for us to think that the majority of men are fools under all circumstances. The less optimistic corollary to this is that all of us are stupid fools in at least some situations, and to make matters worse, we are least likely to recognize those situations when we are in the middle of them. Different people are stupid in different situations. A single person can be a pristine example of how to avoid this trap in one area of their life, but fall headlong into it in another area. I make no claim to be an exception to this rule. The same held true during the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis was built on this type of stupidity. Many people easily perceive and decry this failing in others while completely failing to notice it in themselves. Here too, I make no claim to be an exception. This is one of the reasons why, even on an unexamined utilitarianism, we ought to vigorously protect everyone's individual liberties, so that those people who get it right can have the chance to persuade everyone else who is being stupid. If someone is really being stupid, their stupidity will, on its own, incur plenty of natural consequences if they persist in being stupid. Piling artificial legal consequences on top of the natural ones is just vindictive and only adds unnecessary suffering. Bonhoeffer also wrote, "We know that to sow and to nourish mistrust is one of the most reprehensible things, and that, instead, trust is to be strengthened and advanced wherever possible. Whether the pretext is political ideology or public health, sowing mistrust is a go-to play for totalitarian regimes throughout human history. Anyone could be an informer who denounces you. Compulsory masking successfully sowed and nourished mistrust like few other measures in history, pushing the message that you should be very afraid because anyone could be carrying a virus that could infect and kill you. The masking mentality sees dissent as an existential threat. It seeks to shut down debate through force. This tendency is part of human nature and has not changed for thousands of years. It shows up in multiple different contexts. It is as old as the Bible. When the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar was besieging Jerusalem, the prophet Jeremiah urged surrender. "This is what the Lord says, whoever stays in this city will die by the sword, famine, or plague, but whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live. They will escape with their lives. They will live. And this is what the Lord says, this city will certainly be given into the hands of the army of the king of Babylon, who will capture it." Jeremiah 38, 2-4. The response of those who disagreed with Jeremiah was not debate, setting an example by their courage defending the walls, or even to simply expel him from the city. Instead, the officials said to the king, "This man should be put to death. He is discouraging the soldiers who are left in this city, as well as all the people by the things he is saying to them. This man is not seeking the good of these people, but their ruin." How many times were similar accusations flung at those who refused to comply with one or another of the ostensibly anti-COVID measures? Emotional blackmail was used to push compulsory masking, and vituperation was systematically directed at those who quite rightly objected and resisted. The masking mentality involves a mindset of fear. It confuses what is theoretically possible with what is likely or certain. The masking mentality habitually conflates sins of omission with sins of commission, as though refusing to do something for someone is the same as doing something to them. The masking mentality has a knee-jerk authoritarian reflex. It follows rules simply because they are rules. The masking mentality is characterized by non sequiturs. "It is good for me to wear a mask, therefore everyone should do it." Or, "This works, therefore it should be mandatory." The masking mentality involves outsourcing one's critical reasoning. Václav Havel's description of totalitarianism applies. An essential aspect of this ideology is the consignment of reason and conscience to a higher authority. The principle involved here is that the center of power is identical with the center of truth. The masking mentality will often disparage an unappealing explanation by arguing that the explanation itself needs to be explained before it can be accepted. It is the sort of mentality that says, until you show me why masks don't work to stop disease transmission, you should wear one. Under the masking mentality, few, if any, sources are cited to bolster confident pronouncements that the evidence is overwhelming. When sources are cited, they are typically secondary sources at best, most often tertiary ones. Nevertheless, personal judgment must capitulate to authority, no matter how well that personal judgment is informed by original sources and primary evidence. People operating under the masking mentality may actually be very well versed in what their particular source of authority says, but may brush off, completely ignore, or be unable to support other even more basic assumptions, such as whether their authority should be trusted in the first place. They may, for example, be able to quote CDC recommendations chapter and verse, but be completely unaware of the massive body of literature which the CDC ignored when coming up with its recommendations, and they simply take for granted that the CDC should be everyone's ultimate authority on individual preventative medicine in the first place. Confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, and cognitive dissonance are integral components of the masking mentality. Under the masking mentality, actions that are fundamentally ritual and superstition are couched in the language of science and then mandated. Gut fear gets the final say. The rituals are intended to alleviate primal fears, but in reality they perpetuate and exacerbate those fears. Being an amateur does not make someone automatically wrong, and being an expert does not make someone automatically right. But the masking mentality default rebuttal is ad hominem attack based on credentials and motivations. The worst motivations are assigned to those who disagree about matters of fact, such as whether or not unmasked and unvaccinated people are truly a threat to those around them. Those operating under the masking mentality seek to place the entire burden of proof on the opposing side while denying their own burden of proof. One way this is done is to subtly frame a debate as a proposition in which all one side has to do is play the skeptic instead of a question where both sides have to defend their position. It is the difference between being willing to debate the question, should people be forced to wear masks, versus demanding, prove to me that you should not have to wear a mask. Just because mask mandates are gone does not mean the masking mentality is gone. Widespread compulsory masking has already happened twice, first during the Spanish flu and now during the COVID crisis. During the intervening century, dehumanizing treatment of prisoners and unexamined best practices for evidence-based infection control in the medical field served as institutional reservoirs for masking. This second time around, the masking mentality really got its hooks into a large subset of the population. The second time happened because the first time was never repudiated and guarded against. The only way to keep the masking mentality from achieving the same dominance it did in 2020 is to strengthen and reaffirm the intellectual, moral, and spiritual principles that provide immunity, not by trying to force belief as though it were a compulsory mask or vaccine, but by persuasion, example, and an unyielding defense of our own individual boundaries. This can only take place voluntarily at an individual level. If even 20% of the population had resolutely opposed compulsory masking, refusing to comply under any circumstances, compulsory masking and everything that followed from it would have collapsed before it even got going, and much of the harm that followed afterwards would have been avoided. This is analogous to dealing with a virus that cannot be eliminated. When you cannot eliminate a virus, the next best option is to strengthen as many people as possible to achieve pre-existing immunity or to recover without assistance. Those who started out immune or recover on their own can provide palliative care for those who need help to recover. The more people that recover, the less vulnerable those who are perpetually susceptible to the social influences involved become. When it comes to the mentality that the COVID crisis was built on, you cannot prevent exposure and you cannot guarantee pre-existing immunity. So the best defense is to strengthen as many individuals as possible and to vigorously uphold the individual liberties that those with innate or acquired immunity can exercise to help others recover. The more you bolster your own innate immunities, the more you help those around you. Ash's findings and Milgram's exit interviews. When no alternatives are visible, group pressure and groupthink can easily produce a self-reinforcing mass hysteria, delusion, or mass formation. If anyone wonders how cultures like the Aztecs could come to institutionalize practices like human sacrifice, the COVID crisis was our practical introduction to the first steps in that process. In one sense, the findings of Solomon Asch, Stanley Milgram, and their successors on obedience and conformity are a complete black pill. But variations in their basic experiments also revealed ways in which the forces of group influence can be mitigated or reversed by those willing to stand on their convictions. In Asch's original experiment, when the test subject had a partner who agreed with their answers, conformity to the group error decreased by 2/3, from 30% of test subjects to just 10%. When you refuse to conform to a group error by wearing a mask, you help others by filling that role. When Solomon Asch inverted his experiment, using a majority of test subjects, but adding a single accomplice who consistently dissented by giving wrong answers, the majority did not take the dissenter seriously. They even found him amusing. Contagious laughter spread through the group at the droll minority. However, when Asch increased the number of accomplices giving the wrong answer to at least 3, he found that the attitude of derision in the majority turns to seriousness and increased respect. Vocal, determined minorities can shift the majority. This is why totalitarianism demands 100% conformity and compliance, and the presence of this demand for 100% conformity and compliance is a dead giveaway. In the 2012 study examining peer influence on people's beliefs about the morality of torture, which we looked at in our review of mask psychology, those with pre-existing strongly held moral convictions were far less likely to change their stance on torture than were their peers who held no such beliefs. This was especially true when their moral pre-commitments were informed by religious belief. This type of conviction was exhibited by at least 2 of the subjects in Stanley Milgram's original experiments. These 2 men were part of the minority that refused to proceed past the 150-volt shock when the learner demanded to be released, and they held to their refusal in spite of the lab-coded authority figure's promptings. In his book, Milgram describes the reasons which both of these men gave for how they were able to resist the inhumane orders from an authority figure. One of the men was a teacher of Old Testament liturgy. When asked, "What in your opinion is the most effective way to strengthen resistance to inhumane authority?" he answered, "If one had as one's ultimate authority God, then it trivializes human authority." The other man was an electrical engineer by the name of Jan Rensselaer. He stopped giving the shocks for 2 reasons. First, he knew from personal experience how the victim must feel. He said, "I know what shocks do to you. I'm an electrical engineer, and I have had shocks, and you get real shook up by them, especially if you know the next one is coming." Second, he refused to assign any responsibility for his actions to anyone else in the experiment. When asked who was responsible for shocking the learner against his will, he said, "I would put it on myself entirely. I am responsible." Breaking the diffusion of responsibility is one of the 10 steps that Dr. Zimbardo listed to help resist unwanted influences in his book The Lucifer Effect, Understanding How Good People Turn Evil. During COVID, there was a lot of equivocation over what individual responsibility meant. Advocates for mandates argued that diffusion of responsibility is exactly what people who refused to wear masks or get vaccinated were wrongfully doing. Mandate proponents argued that refusing to wear a mask, and later refusing to get a vaccine, was refusing to take responsibility for one's part in public health by potentially spreading infections the refusers did not even know they had. This was and is simply wrong. Setting aside the general rule that, by definition, transient infections with no symptoms are not major public health threats, refusing to hold other people responsible for one's own personal health and vice versa is the indispensable first step in taking real responsibility for one's part in the overall public health. Every human action has the potential to spread germs, and we depend on microbes for our very existence. If we could somehow achieve aseptic perfection and eliminate the spread of all germs, all we would get for our trouble would be a sterile world devoid of any organic life. There are multiple ways to reduce the risk of disease. Who is so presumptuous that they can insist that one person who manages to achieve a 100% reduction in their personal risk of a given disease is doing more to benefit public health than another person who achieves a somewhat lower reduction in risk from multiple diseases by generally healthy living or some other method? Medical and public health recommendations are just as prone to fads as any other academic discipline. Failing to make use of the latest obsessive public health craze does nothing to anyone else. At the most, it is refusing to do something for someone, and that is very different. You are responsible for those things which you can control, not for every possible outcome your actions or non-actions could possibly lead to. I am responsible does not mean you are responsible for someone else's overall well-being or for every bad outcome in the chain of events your actions happen to be part of, as the crude consequentialism behind mask mandates assumed. Rather, it means that your actions, your life, and your health are ultimately your own responsibility and not someone else's. The same applies to other people. Regardless of where, why, when, or how SARS-CoV-2 originated, ultimately the only ones answerable for our individual responses to it were ourselves. The worst harms from COVID did not come from SARS-CoV-2, but from our response to SARS-CoV-2, and were self-inflicted, not just on ourselves, but on our children and grandchildren. What you do matters. When it came to masking and other COVID lockdown measures, seemingly trivial acts made a difference. Mutual encouragement and evidence-based sparring in various forums were not wastes of time. The people pushing masking and other measures were just as human as anyone else, and many, if not most, were even more sensitive to social pressure and averse to confrontation. However, verbal dissent can only do so much. In Milgram's experiments, virtually all of the subjects dissented verbally, but only a minority stopped administering the shocks. In a way, having the option of verbal dissent acted as a pressure release valve that helped enhance behavioral compliance. Of the minority of dissenters in Milgram's experiments who went beyond verbal dissent and refused to continue, none took further steps beyond non-participation to challenge the experiment's existence. Philip Zimbardo's assistant professor and future wife, Christina Maslach, laid out the ramifications. Suppose it was not an experiment. Suppose Milgram's cover story were true, that researchers were studying the role of punishment in learning and memory and would be testing about 1,000 participants in a host of experiments to answer their practical questions about the educational value of judiciously administered punishment. If you disobeyed, refused to continue, got paid, and left silently, your heroic action would not prevent the next 999 participants from experiencing the same distress. It would be an isolated event without social impact unless it included going to the next step of challenging the entire structure and assumptions of the research. Disobedience by the individual must get translated into systemic disobedience that forces change in the situation or agency itself, and not just in some operating conditions. It is too easy for evil situations to co-opt the intentions of good dissidents or even heroic rebels by giving them medals for their deeds and a gift certificate for keeping their opinions to themselves. To be fair to Milgram's subjects, some might very well have taken concrete steps against the experiments if the ruse had not been revealed to them immediately at the conclusion of their session, when they were presented with the victim, who they saw to be healthy, friendly, and in good spirits. The point remains, however, that direct behavioral challenges to compulsory masking and other COVID crisis overreach by non-participation were and remain absolutely indispensable. The little things mattered, even if it was just a little bit of passive aggression like making a habit of not putting on a mask until directly asked to do so. Those who were willing to go the next step and further challenge the existence of compulsory masking performed a service for everyone. These individuals sacrificed to do so, whether by giving up time, money, and energy, paying a fine, suffering an arrest, losing a job, being denied access to school, or various forms of social humiliation and ostracism. This is true even in those cases where the individuals challenging compulsory masking were obnoxious or belligerent about it. People who refused to wear masks were, at best, derided as being dangerously irresponsible and treated accordingly. Some endured quietly, but many, very understandably and not entirely inaccurately, perceived attempts to pressure them to wear a mask as an aggressive violation of an intensely personal boundary, bordering on a common law form of battery, and responded accordingly. Many of the authors and thinkers whose work we have examined also offer valuable insights into what we can do on an individual basis to inoculate ourselves against situational, psychological, social, and spiritual forces pushing us into a majority path to immoral actions or becoming compliant and complicit in a way that we later look back on with guilt, shame, and a desire to rationalize. In his book, The Lucifer Effect, Philip Zimbardo suggests 10 statements that, if internalized, help us resist situational forces which may be pushing us to do the wrong thing. He also provided prescient warnings that too many people ignored during COVID. The Mephistophelian tempter will argue that his power to save you depends upon all the people making small sacrifices of this little right or that small freedom. Reject that deal. Never sacrifice basic personal freedoms for the promise of security, because the sacrifices are real and immediate and the security is a distant illusion. In his book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, Robert Cialdini provides an example of how to consciously define ourselves in such a way that we are more likely to stay open-minded and less likely to fall for the type of behavioral manipulations employed during the COVID crisis. The Czech statesman Václav Havel and the dissident Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn also offer valuable insights into how totalitarian systems function and how the smallest actions or non-actions can have a paradigm-changing cumulative impact for good. The only person we can control is ourself. All of us, if we are being honest, will admit that even that control is at best incomplete. The most accessible and the most important actions we can take are internal. To the extent that our internal house is out of order, our external efforts will be undermined and may even be vulnerable to misdirection or misuse. A good first step is to consciously determine your values, where your own personal boundaries lie, and what you are willing to do, pay, or sacrifice to hold on to them. Are you willing to sacrifice time? Money? Are you willing to deal with dirty looks from strangers? Awkward social situations? Worse? When confronted by something like widespread COVID crisis masks and lockdowns, prioritize enough time and mental effort to figure out where your own personal lines in the sand are. This includes both where they actually are and where you want them to be. Determine what you are able to do and what you are willing to do to push back, and then do that thing, however small, to the best of your ability. Gradual successive steps most easily lead downwards, but they can also lead upwards. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn pointed out, if civil disobedience à la Gandhi is too much, then the simplest key to liberation is a personal non-participation in lies. We are not called upon to step out onto the square and shout out the truth, to say out loud what we think. This is scary. We are not ready. But let us at least refuse to say what we do not think. Follow through and make habits of whatever positive actions or non-actions you are willing and able to take. Step back and reevaluate from time to time. I speak from experience when I say that your own personal breaking point can and will change over time, in a good way. You will get stronger if you figure out what small steps you are willing to take in the direction you want to go and then follow through. If you are new to this sort of thing, start small. Even as minor an act as refusing to put on a mask until someone directly tells you to do so can have a large cumulative effect if enough people do it. Courage and personal boundaries are like muscles. They get stronger the more you make use of them. At any rate, such minor acts set good internal precedents. My own assessment is that individuals can make the most predictable impact by starting closest to home, inside their own minds, and working outwards and upwards from there. Florida lawyer Jeff Childers' advocacy mantra is local, local, local for a good reason, though your own circumstances may compel you to start bigger. Oftentimes, the most selfless and effective thing you can do is simply to implacably hold your own personal line in the sand. Letting any observers know what you are doing and why you are doing it will make your stand more effective. In this book, we have looked in depth at many of the manipulations, fallacies, tricks, and nudges used to push masks. I cannot claim to be immune to these things when I encounter them in other areas of my own life, but that's part of the overall point. No one is immune. Not me, not you, not doctors, not public health officials, and especially not politicians. If anything, politicians may be more susceptible because they earn their living by their skill in recognizing and appropriating social trends. These vulnerabilities, by their very nature, live in our personal blind spots, and we're better at spotting them in others than in ourselves, which is also part of human nature. However, with conscious effort, we can shrink our personal blind spots and diminish the extent to which we engage in defective thinking. We can stay alert for cues that influence tactics are being used to manipulate us. They're usually pretty easy to spot once you learn to recognize them, especially when they are used en masse. Brute coercion, moving goalposts, and gaslighting are all, of course, giant red flags. When all else fails, weigh the opposing arguments as best you can, stand firm on fundamental principles, and let other people do the same. When in doubt and push comes to shove, do not let yourself be pushed into making exceptions based on emergency and necessity. Be open to reevaluating your positions, but remain indomitable in the defense of your personal boundaries. At a minimum, I recommend taking the time to make a conscious addition to your self-definition. If you make a mental note or internal commitment, that is better than nothing. If you write your commitment down, simply having done so, and the physical reminder you produce, will make you adhere to it more closely and consistently. Handwriting works better than typing because the additional time, effort, and personalization enhance psychological commitment. If you share your commitment with others, you are even more likely to follow it when the going gets tough, though you do run the risk of having your failure to live up to one or more of your commitments pointed out to you in the heat of the moment. Such is life. I share my own personal resolution here as an example and perhaps a jumping-off point for anyone else inclined to make one. It is drawn from all the works we have looked at together, including those in the appendix. It is perpetually in progress, and I do not claim to always live up to it. In fact, I routinely fall short. It is as much a statement of aspiration as it is a statement of present reality, but in adhering to it as best I can, I become less vulnerable to groupthink, mass hysteria, and compromising sacred values. Commitment to an ideal does not mean perfection in pursuit of that ideal. Strive for excellence, not perfection. Some internal rebuke for failure may be warranted, but there's a point where self-flagellation becomes counterproductive, unhealthy, or self-indulgent. Here's my personal resolution. I hold ideas, but I do not become my ideas. My views are based on the information, evidence, arguments, and experiences I have had to date. I can and do modify my views as I encounter more or better information, evidence, arguments, and experiences. I am willing to evaluate information, evidence, and arguments even when those things come from sources that I regard as unfriendly or antagonistic. I am willing to admit to error. I do not affirm what I know or believe to be untrue. I defend my personal boundaries. I consistently second-guess my motivations and my reasoning. I do not blindly follow authority, nor do I consign my reason and my conscience to any human authority. I value my integrity more than I value group acceptance. Even if I am ordered to do something, I will still bear ultimate responsibility for having done it. I can and do turn off my autopilot, pause, take a step back, and critically evaluate a situation, especially when something does not seem right. I do not allow the present moment to dominate me. My present actions are informed by my memory of the past and desires for the future. I do not sacrifice fundamental principles and freedoms for safety. I can and do oppose unjust rules. When you take a stand to oppose things like compulsory masking, there are at least 4 broad objectives that you can achieve regardless of what anyone else does, assuming you do not quit. You can make the arguments. You can set an example. Dealing with you forces the other side to actually get their unstated arguments and assumptions out in the open where they can be addressed directly. You can enhance informed consent, one way or the other. I am big on informed consent, and if you've read this book, you probably are too. Where coercion is present, informed consent is not. As you begin to enforce your boundaries, do your best not to hand would-be tyrants an easy win. Sometimes, even when physically fighting back is more than morally justified, the most effective way to win is still to take a punch and then turn the other cheek to take another one without backing down. Even when you know your rights are being violated, the authorities who are in the process of violating them will give each other every benefit of the doubt and seize on any excuse to justify each other's actions, up to and past the point of reason. If you are going against the herd, you can expect the opposite of that, at least at first. Expect to have your motives, maturity, intellect, and integrity routinely referred to as worse than garbage. It's wrong, it's not fair, and it's not how the law itself says it is supposed to be applied, but that is still how it works in situations like the COVID crisis. So be strategic, sober-minded, and self-disciplined. When you exercise your rights in a context where an authority is determined to violate them and thinks they have the moral and legal high ground, then you give yourself the best fighting chance for ultimate vindication if you assert your rights in a manner that makes it as obvious as possible to every semi-objective outside observer that the authorities violating your rights are in the wrong. This may require immense patience, forbearance, and self-discipline, because it means getting repeatedly kicked around and not reciprocating despite your legitimate right of self-defense. An outstanding example of this is the conduct of the civil rights student protesters we discussed earlier, whose First Amendment rights were eventually vindicated by the Supreme Court in Edwards v. South Carolina. the Supreme Court made clear that it was their conduct in the face of blatantly unfair treatment that made the difference. Not until they were told by police officials that they must disperse on pain of arrest did they do more. Even then, they but sang patriotic and religious songs after one of their leaders had delivered a religious harangue. There was no violence or threat of violence on their part, or on the part of any member of the crowd watching them. If, for example, the petitioners had been convicted upon evidence that they had violated a law regulating traffic, or had disobeyed a law reasonably limiting the periods during which the State House grounds were open to the public, this would be a different case. Even then, the winning students still had to endure through a 2-year process of repeatedly losing at the local court level and the appellate court level, with fines or imprisonment adding injury to injury and no guarantee of final success. A common thread in court cases that resulted in landmark decisions upholding Americans' essential individual liberties was that the vast majority of the time, the person whose liberty was finally vindicated had lost at the level of one or more lower courts. Don't despair. It's okay to get tired. It's okay to get discouraged. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's okay to take a mental health break to remind yourself why you are fighting. If you've reached the point past which you are not willing to go to resist, it may even be okay to step back. One thing you must not do, however, is despair. Even after a final court adverse ruling, the passage of new laws and ordinances, or the repeal of old ones, can easily shift the legal landscape, creating new avenues and reopening old ones. Quitting in despair is the only guaranteed way to lose, and sometimes a tactical loss is necessary to pave the way for a strategic victory. If you are resisting a mask mandate within almost any setting, you are likely to find yourself having to pursue whatever administrative process for accommodation is in place. Don't expect immediate success. In fact, expect to lose at the lowest levels and have to appeal. There is almost always an appeal process, even when it is not obvious at first glance. Do expect it to be a massive time sink, but don't use that expectation to lower the quality of your work. Your job is to exhaust any administrative remedies and to make the bar for denying your accommodation request as high as possible. Authorities are human too, and have other issues on their plates. It is even possible they secretly loathe the mandates they are enforcing and are just waiting for a good challenge to materialize to provide them with an excuse to rescind it. However, don't ever assume this is the case unless you have strong evidence. It's much more likely that the opposing authorities have internalized the enforcement of the mask mandate as an extension of their own personal authority and will see any challenge to the mandate as a personal attack. Always imagine a future time when today's deed will be on trial and no one will accept your pleas of only following orders or everyone else was doing it. Philip Zimbardo, The Lucifer Effect, 2007. Whatever you are opposing, do not fall for attempts to guilt you into complying with something that your conscience is uneasy with or revolts against. It is usually pretty easy to tell the difference between the unease that comes from a pricked conscience and simple fear. Standing up for your individual rights is not selfish, and when you uphold one person's rights, including your own, you uphold everyone's. We all know going against the herd is scary, and for good reason. Don't beat yourself up by shooting for perfection or expecting to convert people on the first try. In most cases, the best you can do is simply to raise the bar that someone's cognitive dissonance has to vault over to reach their current conclusion. Do be strategic about where you put your efforts. There is a certain percentage of the population your efforts are just going to be wasted on. Another subset of people will be naturally more amenable to giving you a genuine hearing. Sometimes the right crucial piece of information enables a lightning-fast volte-face, but for most of us, coming around takes time and happens gradually by degrees. Gradual successive steps moving either upwards or downwards. Even if you manage to wear someone down, they may very well resent you to the extent you did so. Note that this does not mean you should not be persistent. The line between what comes across as being persistent versus trying to grind someone down varies from person to person, but persistence is essential. Acknowledging error, even privately to ourselves, is difficult and painful. Solomon Asch observed that once a subject had yielded to the group, he continued to yield more than previously independent subjects. Having once committed himself to yielding, the individual finds it difficult and painful to change his direction. To do so is tantamount to a public admission that he has not acted rightly. He therefore follows the precarious course he has already chosen in order to maintain an outward semblance of consistency and conviction. The mere act of not wearing a mask under the same circumstances where masks were previously worn can't help but be a symbolic repudiation of previous mask wearing. The behavioral psychology we examined earlier when looking at the work of Robert Cialdini predicted what we all saw happen as masking started to lose ground in hearts and minds while advocates doubled down. Because the only acceptable form of truth had been undercut by physical proof, there was but one way out of the corner for the group. It had to create another type of proof for the truth of its beliefs: social proof. Because the physical evidence could not be changed, the social evidence had to be. Convince, and ye shall be convinced. Conclusion. In Federalist Number 8, Alexander Hamilton warned about how a perpetual state of war leads to the gradual erosion of a people's essential liberties. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subjected to frequent infringements on their rights, which serve to weaken their sense of those rights, and by degrees the people are brought to consider the soldiery not only as their protectors but as their superiors. The transition from this disposition to that of considering them masters is neither remote nor difficult, but it is very difficult to prevail upon a people under such impressions to make a bold or effectual resistance to usurpations supported by the military power. What Hamilton did not anticipate was that metaphorical wars could achieve the same result, whether the war is a war on terrorism, a war on drugs, a war on poverty, or a war on a particular disease. The pretext of increasing safety has always been a useful tool for expanding power, but over the last 150 years, a new public health soldiery and aristocracy has quietly developed. The COVID crisis brought this class to the forefront and revealed just how much power and influence it had already accrued. Masking during the COVID crisis was so divisive because it embodied differences in fundamental belief that have always coexisted in America. Tensions stemming from irreconcilable disagreements so fundamental cannot resolve completely, even between people of goodwill who genuinely love each other. It is the same tension experienced by members of families who hold different religious beliefs, sometimes even different beliefs within the same religious tradition. These disagreements may take a back seat to more pressing concerns or be relegated to the periphery of awareness such that you can almost forget about them, but they come back to the forefront during a crisis the moment their real-life implications become unavoidable. On a practical level, the options for dealing with differences in belief this divergent are either force, persuasion, or learning to live with the tension. In this multiple-choice test, compulsory masking and other mandatory COVID crisis measures were not just a wrong answer, but the worst answer. They physically forced the beliefs of one segment of the population onto everyone else's faces. People who got it right on masks rarely did so based on chance alone, and attempts to frame the issue that way are mistaken at best and a form of gaslighting at worst. People who rightly perceived the underlying ideology and struggled against the COVID crisis tyranny, whether they did so from the start or came around slowly, deserve to celebrate that fact. At the same time, we also need to be careful for the simple reason that it is entirely possible for even luminaries like John Adams to be instrumental in the War of Independence and then sign the Alien and Sedition Acts in complete violation of the First Amendment less than 20 years afterwards. People in the minority that turned the tide this time need to maintain their vigilance and introspection because they could very easily find themselves on the side they now oppose when it comes to another future issue. This is why we need to vigorously reaffirm and defend the unalienable rights that all individuals possess. The next time something like this happens, we may find ourselves in the place of those people who took a long time to come around during COVID. We need to protect the rights of those people who followed the herd this time because they may be the ones setting the example that helps restore us the next time history starts rhyming. We have learned from painful experience that compliance is only a virtue depending on what we are complying with, and that complying with demands and rules made by bullies, fearmongers, or would-be humanitarian tyrants only makes things worse. Firm adherence to principles, especially those natural law principles of individual liberty recognized by the Bill of Rights, are essential to immunizing ourselves against falling prey to panic. Even when we personally get something wrong, if we honor the liberty of others to set a contrary example to what we think is the best course of action, we still benefit even on a utilitarian outlook, because this creates voluntary control groups composed of subjects who can cross over at any time. If we are right, the other group serves as additional evidence and a warning, who we help by our example. But for those times when we are in the wrong, this other group will provide an essential example that can help restore us. However you decide to oppose compulsory masking and the mentality that gave birth to it, whether by lobbying representatives in your state legislature to add involuntary masking to your state's Tort Claims Act, debating masks on the street, or simple stubborn noncompliance, Godspeed. If we fail to uphold and defend the principles of individual liberty right now, then at some point people will argue for compulsory masking again with some new disease, in spite of its glaring failure with COVID. Plenty of people are still willing to argue that masks will work against the next disease du jour, or that masking in the context of COVID was eventually overturned not because it was immoral and ineffective, but because COVID-19 was not enough of an emergency, or we didn't mask hard enough. We, our children, and our grandchildren, and future generations will be forcibly masked and worse on a recurring basis until enough of us on an individual level resolve, at the very least with regard to masks and anything else that we know to be based in lies and manipulation, in the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, let their rule hold not through me.